I never imagined that the cruelest words of my life would come from the very children I had poured my youth into raising. That evening, the living room was lit as it always was. My 3 children gathered. It looked like a normal family get-together. But no, that was the moment my heart was torn apart. Anna, my eldest daughter, suddenly burst into sobs, her cries choked with accusation. She looked straight at me, eyes full of resentment. "Because you were poor, I had to give up my dreams. Do you know that? I wanted to study design in New York, but you said we didn't have the money. I had to study something I never liked because you couldn't provide." I was stunned. In my memory, that was when Anna was 18. I was working 2 part-time jobs and scraping together every penny for her tuition. I remember sitting up with her all night going over the feasible options, and she nodded and agreed to choose a school nearby. I had believed she understood our circumstances, that she would not blame me. Yet now those tears turned all my sacrifices into a crime. Before I could utter a word of explanation, David, my second child, sat up straight, his cold stare cutting into me. "Mother, you ruined our lives. You don't know how to manage money. You don't know how to guide us. We have no bright future because we've always had to live in the poverty you created." I felt as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water in my face. Each word, each syllable was like a hammer striking my chest. I tried to move my lips, wanting to say that I had done my utmost, that I chose to keep them with me rather than send them to some single mother facility, that I gritted my teeth and endured so they could have a home. But David didn't give me the chance. He kept looking at me, eyes full of rage, as if every burden in his life was my fault. Michael, the youngest, said nothing. He bowed his head, his gaze avoiding mine. But that silence hurt more than any accusation, for I saw in his eyes a tacit agreement, an acceptance that yes, Mother was the cause of all their failures. I sat there with trembling hands resting on my knees, my face expressionless. Outside, I nodded slightly, pretending to be resigned. But inside, my heart was shattered. For so many years, I thought that if I loved them with my whole being, someday they would understand. But now, the children I loved most had all risen up at once to deny everything. I don't remember how long I sat there. I only heard Anna's choked sobs, David's bitter voice, and the heavy emptiness Michael left in his silence. The familiar living room suddenly felt foreign. Every family photo on the wall, ones I had once cherished, now seemed like thorns pricking my eyes. Was that smile real or just an illusion I had been fooling myself with all along? A wrenching question echoed through my head. What then was the purpose of all those years of hardship? I had refused a marriage proposal so no one would have the right to mistreat or discriminate against my children. I stayed up late sewing Anna's dress for the prom. I took out payday loans so David could have a laptop for college. I cooked dozens of Michael's favorite dishes whenever he was sad. Yet now all of it is reduced to 2 words. You're to blame. The space in the living room felt suffocating. I heard my heart pounding wildly. I wanted to jump up and shout, "I did everything for you." But I only sat still, lips pressed together, saying nothing. I understood that no matter what I said, they would not listen. They only saw me as a burden, as the cause, no longer as their mother. In that collapsing moment, I knew one thing. Perhaps my role as their mother had officially ended. Not because I wanted it to, but because those accusations had severed the last thread that connected us. Outside the window, the wind blew hard. The curtain fluttered. I took a deep breath, forcing my face not to change. If I cried, I would be further demeaned. So I sat there silently, nodding, letting the invisible knife cut through the layers of my heart. And in that moment of ruin, I realized maternal love was no longer a shield. It had become a wound that the very children I loved most had just ripped open without hesitation. That night, I lay in the familiar bedroom, feeling like I did not belong there anymore. The yellow light cast a pale glow, highlighting the deep wrinkles at the corners of my eyes. I heard the clock ticking, each tick like a blade slicing through memories. Every "you ruined our lives" reverberated like bells, forcing me to face the life behind me. I turned on the old mattress that had formed to my shape. In the dark, images from the past surged back, piece by piece, forming a film no one would want to watch, but one I had to confront. I remembered when my husband suddenly died in an accident, leaving behind 3 tiny children. People said I was young and could remarry. Many men proposed, even promising my children a full home. But deep down, I knew no one could love them like I could. I refused time after time, choosing to be a single mother. I chose to remain in poverty so my children would not suffer from a stepmother's disdain. I believed that choice was the highest form of love. Yet today it has become the excuse for my children to blame my poverty on me. In the years that followed, I pushed myself. By day, I worked as a clerk at a supermarket. By night, I sewed clothes for others. Sometimes I cleaned houses. There were days my hands bled from the needle, my back ached from standing for hours, but I clenched my teeth and endured. Just thinking of Anna arriving at school with a clean uniform, David having new books for studying, and Michael having sneakers that wouldn't make him the target of teasing gave me the strength to keep going. I believed that if I tried a little harder, their futures would be different. I remember clearly there was a time on Anna's birthday when I didn't have enough money to buy the dress she had always longed for. I ran everywhere, and in the end borrowed a hot loan with a cutthroat interest rate just to see the radiant smile of my daughter when she put on the new dress. I thought that moment would stay imprinted forever in her heart. But now all Anna remembers is, because you were poor, I lost my dream. Every Christmas season, I would decorate our small house with cheap trinkets from the market. I tried to make them feel cozy. I stayed up late baking, wrapping gifts, and placing them under the fake Christmas tree. I wanted my 3 children to believe that even in poverty, our home still had joy, still had magic. But those miracles, it turns out, only lived in my memory. For them, perhaps it was nothing but scarcity, nothing but comparison with richer friends. All my life, I turned myself into the ground for my children to walk upon, never thinking that the ground too can crack, can hurt. I had told myself, as long as they succeed, all these hardships will be worth it. But tonight, hearing their accusations, I realized in their eyes my sacrifice was not love, but a burden. I turned my face to the wall, tears soaking the pillow. I asked myself, was I wrong? Wrong for loving too much? Wrong for putting them above even myself? I had never once asked, what do I want? I only knew how to ask, what do my children need? Those times I refused chances to grow, the youthful dreams I buried, the trips that remained only in imagination, all of it I cast aside, saving every cent for my children. But when I look back, all I see is a cold emptiness. I poured out my whole life to build, yet all I received was an invisible sentence. You ruined our lives. That night was longer than any night in my life. I couldn't close my eyes. The sound of the wind blowing through the cracks in the door felt like a cruel reminder that some kinds of love will never be acknowledged. I felt something inside my heart splinter, a disillusionment that could never be mended. And for the first time, in the darkness, I dared whisper a sentence I had never thought of before. Maybe it's time I stopped sacrificing. The next morning, my eyes were swollen from a sleepless night. I sat by the window, watching sunlight filter through the thin curtain, my heart heavy as stone. The accusations of my children still echoed in my head, impossible to shake off. I felt suffocated to the point where I had to step outside to find somewhere I could breathe. I wandered to the little cafe at the corner, the place where Margaret, my best friend since girlhood, and I used to meet on rare, free occasions. I wasn't sure she would be there, but when I pushed the door open, I saw her familiar figure sitting at the corner table, steam rising from her coffee cup. Eleanor. Margaret looked up. Her eyes lit up, then froze as she saw my worn face. She set her cup down quickly and gripped my hands. Oh my God, what happened to you? I tried to force a smile, but everything collapsed. Hot tears spilled right there in the crowded cafe. I pulled my hands free, dabbing at them with a tissue, but my throat was locked tight. They said I ruined their lives, I blurted out between sobs. Margaret was silent for a few seconds, her eyes flashing with shock. But then, instead of the shallow comfort I half expected, she only sighed and spoke slowly. Eleanor, you've spoiled them too long. Your children are used to blaming you. Over time, they've come to see your sacrifice as a given and their struggles as your fault. I looked at Margaret, feeling as though I'd been slapped. I wanted to protest, to defend my children. I stammered, but they're my flesh and blood. They're everything to me. If I don't give them, who will? Margaret looked straight at me, her voice firm. You're 70, Eleanor. How many more years do you have to keep enduring? Your children need to live their own lives. What I'm about to say might hurt, but have you ever asked yourself, what do you want? I froze. In 70 years, I had never once asked that question of myself. I only asked, what do my children need? What are they lacking? Never once did I ask, am I tired? Am I happy? Margaret squeezed my hand, her voice dropping low. You are not a criminal. But if you keep giving without keeping anything for yourself, you'll have nothing left. In the end, your children will have no mother, and you'll have no self. Those words cut into my heart like a cold blade, yet they also woke me. I felt both pain and hollowness. I wanted to argue, but the more I thought, the less reason I had to prove Margaret wrong. I sat still, eyes on the window, watching parents pass by outside with their children. A numb sadness rose inside me. I used to be like them, holding my children in my arms, believing that unconditional love would be repaid with love. But now, all I got back were bitter words. Margaret took a slow sip of coffee and continued. Try just once to live for yourself, Eleanor. You have the right to rest, to enjoy life. Your children are grown. They must take care of themselves. If you keep holding on, you're only helping them delay their responsibilities. I looked at her, my throat tight. Half of me wanted to scream, no, I can't abandon my children. But the other half, small yet steady, whispered, it's time. We sat like that for a long time. Margaret told me about her new life after retiring, planting flowers, traveling, taking painting classes. I listened with both admiration and bitterness. While she had learned how to savor her old age, I was still bent under the weight of 3 grown children who still behaved like children. When we parted, Margaret hugged me tightly and said, remember my words, Eleanor. Motherhood doesn't mean endless sacrifice. Sometimes silence and walking away are the only ways for them to learn their lesson. I returned home after meeting Margaret, her question still echoing in my mind. What do I want? That question felt like a needle pricking my thoughts, forcing me to examine every hidden corner of my life. For the first time in years, I looked around my familiar house, not with the eyes of a devoted mother, but with sharper, colder eyes, and it was then that the real picture slowly came into view. The dining table still had a few bills left behind. I picked one up and recognized the transfer slip I had sent to Anna just last week. She told me she needed money to pay tuition for her little daughter. I remember that I did not hesitate at all. While I hurried to the bank and made the transfer, now sitting and looking back, I was startled. How many times had I helped her like this already? I began to remember that each time Anna would say, just this once. But there was never a last time. I realized that my love had become an excuse for my daughter to take it for granted that asking for money was normal. I opened the wooden cabinet and rifled through the loan papers. A string of contracts was in my name. Guarantees for David. He had said, Mother, just sign it. I promise I'll pay it back quickly. The project will definitely make a profit. I believed him without a hint of doubt. But year after year, I never saw a single penny come back. Later, he would come again, bringing new promises, new reasons, and I would sign again. Now looking back, I saw myself like someone hypnotized, signing again and again, binding myself into nameless debts. I walked through the living room and stopped in front of the photo of Michael smiling in this house. That house is still under my name, but for many years now he has treated it as his own. He brought his wife and children to live there, redecorated it to suit his tastes, and treated me like a freeloader in the very house I had sweated and saved for. Many times when I wanted to offer a suggestion, he brushed me off. Mother, this is my house now. Let us handle it. I would laugh it off and tell myself that my child's happiness was my happiness. But now I understand it wasn't their happiness. It was their habit of ownership. While I receded into the shadows, I sat down in a chair, my hands trembling as I held a cup of tea. And for the first time, I looked squarely at the truth. I had been used, not once, not twice, but my whole life. My love, my sacrifice, everything had been turned into an endless supply for them to rely on. They no longer saw me as a mother, but as a financial support, a scapegoat to blame whenever life went wrong. My heart ached when I recalled their words from the other day. Anna crying, David accusing, Michael's silent agreement all blending into an indictment against me. But today, when I traced everything, I suddenly saw clearly it was not merely the anger of disappointed children, but the raw exposure of people used to living off someone else. I stood up and walked around the house, Every small corner conjured painful memories. The sofa where David used to sit and ask me to transfer money just to tide things over. The kitchen where Anna used to scold, saying, "If I were richer, her life would be different." Michael's room, where he raised his voice when I refused his suggestion to transfer the house title. "Mother, don't you trust me?" I suddenly realized this house was no longer the place I lived. It had become proof of dependence, of the vicious cycle of exploitation. A strange wave rose within me. Not only pain, but clarity, a smoldering anger. I remembered Margaret's words, "You've indulged them too long." They're used to blaming others. Indeed, all the evidence was right here. I had just been blind to it. I sat at the table and opened an old ledger. On the white page, I wrote down what I had just realized. Anna borrows money continuously and doesn't pay it back. David guarantees loans and breaks promises. Michael occupies the house and assumes it's his. I looked at those 3 lines and tears fell again. But this time they were not tears of weakness. They were the tears of someone who finally saw the stark truth. I had allowed them to use my love as an excuse. And the most painful thing was that I had been enabling them all these years. That night I sat for a long time in the quiet house. I knew that from the moment I realized I had been used, I could not continue living as before. Inside me, a small flame was being lit, the flame of determination, of the desire for freedom. I did not know where I would go or what I would do, but I knew this: I could not let myself be buried another day. And in the silence, for the first time, I dared to think the 2 words I had never spoken aloud. Leave. After that day, I wrote down the truths. My heart felt like it had fallen into an abyss, but at the same time, a strange light rose within me. I knew my life could not continue on autopilot. If I stayed and kept giving, those children would never learn to stand on their own 2 feet, and I would slowly die inside from being despised. Late at night, the house was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I sat at the table and opened an old diary. The yellowed page trembled beneath my old hands. I wrote, day, month, year. I no longer want to be called a burden. I no longer want to live a life where every decision revolves around others' needs. I want to breathe, to live, even if only for the years I have left. I put down the pen, tears sprinkling the paper. But this time, I did not cry from pain. I felt a strange relief, as if at last I dared to name my own small buried desire, a desire buried for 70 years. I began to organize the papers, the guarantee contracts, the transfer slips, the piled-up bills. I sorted them and placed them into a large envelope. I would not let the cycle repeat. Then I pulled a small suitcase from the corner of the closet. It had lain there for years, covered in dust. I opened it, folded a few sets of clothes, a thick coat, and a few old photos I truly cherished. I left the rest behind. I remembered the bank account I had hidden away long ago. Not a lot of money, but enough for me to start over somewhere else. I prepared some cash and carefully put it into my wallet. I also took scissors and shredded the bills, cutting up papers related to the education and medical records of the 3 children I had worked so hard to raise. The scissors rasped. With each snip, I felt the invisible threads being severed bit by bit. I sat still, listening to my heart pounding. At times, I trembled, afraid, wondering if I truly had the courage to do this. I had grown used to living like a shadow for so many years, used to letting others define my worth. Now, standing at the threshold of freedom, I felt both excited and hesitant, like a child. I told myself, "Eleanor, you are no longer young, but it isn't too late. You've sacrificed your whole life. Now try living for yourself." I remembered Margaret's words. Sometimes silence and leaving is the only way for them to learn their lesson. I repeated that line in my head as if it were an affirmation. No need for noise, no need for arguments, no need for any more explanations. Just one quiet decision. I wrote another small note, leaving only a few lines. Don't look for me. Live your own lives. From now on, I am no longer your place to lean on. I folded the paper neatly and placed it on the living room table. Looking at it, I suddenly felt peace. They might be angry. They might resent me. But I knew with certainty this was the only thing I could do to preserve the last of my dignity. Dawn was near. The sky was still sprinkled with stars. I pulled my small suitcase to the door and stood there for a long time. My chest pounded, but my feet were ready. Everything familiar in this house, every frame, every chair, every window had become distant memories. I knew that when this door closed, I would never return as I had before. I drew a deep breath, and in that moment, I felt one thing. I was no longer the weak, exploited mother. I was a woman preparing to choose her own freedom. That morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sunrise had not yet pierced through the curtains, the sky still draped in a thin veil of mist. But I already knew this would be the first day of a different life. I sat up, placed my hand on my chest, and felt each urgent heartbeat, something like fear, but also like the thrill I hadn't felt in years. The house was still quiet, no one awake. I walked through each room, my eyes lingering on everything as if for the last time. The family photo on the wall, which I touched lightly before letting go. The wooden chair where I once sat mending clothes for my children still bore faint scratches. The kitchen, with its old pots and pans, was where I had spent countless nights cooking for them. Everything was still there, but from now on, it would no longer imprison me. I went to the living room and looked at the note I had written the night before, resting neatly on the table. "Don't look for me. Live your own lives." The handwriting trembled, but the message was firm. I smoothed the edge of the paper and breathed deeply. Just a few lines, yet they held the weight of a lifetime I had finally chosen to release. I rolled my suitcase to the door. The sound of the wheels against the tiles was faint, yet in my heart it resounded like a drum announcing a beginning. I opened the door, and the early wind rushed in cool, carrying the scent of fresh grass after a dewy night. For the first time in years, the sky seemed so vast. The moment my foot stepped beyond the threshold, my heart shook. Memories of this house surged all at once, the laughter, the tears, the meals, the quarrels. My eyes blurred, but I wiped them quickly, reminding myself, if I don't keep moving, I'll remain trapped in the past forever. And so I pulled my suitcase forward. The narrow alley leading to the main road was deserted, just a few sparrows chirping on the branches. I heard the wheels scraping against the ground, blending with my racing heartbeat. Each step felt lighter, as though I was shedding one burden after another. This silence was no longer submission. It was my strongest declaration. I hailed a taxi at the end of the alley. The driver, an old man about my age, glanced at the small suitcase and asked, "Heading somewhere early, ma'am?" I gave a slight smile and replied simply, "Going a little far?" He nodded, asking no more. I settled into the back seat, looking out through the misted glass. Familiar sights drifted away. The trees, the rooftops, the market corner, all of it played like a slow-motion film, vanishing bit by bit from my view. Inside me, a strange feeling spread, both pain and release. Pain because I knew I was leaving behind the place that had held my whole life, where I had poured sweat and tears. But release, because I was finally stepping away from the invisible chains that had bound me for too long. The car crossed a bridge spanning a small river. I looked down at the water shimmering in the first light of dawn and saw my reflection, an old, weary face. Yet in the eyes there flickered a new light. I whispered, "Eleanor, you've truly begun." When the car stopped at the town bus station, I pulled my suitcase down and inhaled deeply. No one to see me off, no goodbyes, no lingering looks. Yet my heart felt serene. Freedom doesn't need applause. It only needs a determined step. I bought a ticket for the earliest bus heading toward the sea. My hand shook as I handed over the money, but my heart warmed strangely. I knew I wasn't running away. I was choosing to live. And sometimes choosing to live requires as much courage as going to war. As the bus rolled forward, I leaned my head against the window. The engine's hum blended with the wind, lulling me into a quiet peace. I watched the trees lining the road, sunlight slowly spreading, and inside me, one clear voice rang out. I am no longer anyone's shadow. I am myself. And so, in that silent morning, I officially left. The long bus ride carried me away from the familiar city. The scenery outside retreated, the tall buildings and bustling streets gradually giving way to green rice fields and distant mountains cloaked in mist. I rested my head against the glass, listening to the steady rumble of the engine, my heart empty yet strangely light. This feeling was unlike any journey before because this time I wasn't going to return. I was going to begin. When the bus stopped at a coastal town, I stepped down with my suitcase. The salty breeze rushed into my chest, carrying the steady rhythm of waves in the distance. I stood still for a few minutes, letting the scent of the sea fill my breath, as though it were welcoming me. The town was small, peaceful, free of honking horns and jostling crowds. And in that moment, I felt as if I had just stepped into another world. I rented a small boarding room, its walls simply whitewashed with a window facing the sea. The landlady, a kind old woman, looked at me with sympathetic eyes, asked nothing, only handed me the key and said, "It's very quiet here. Just rest." I nodded, a wave of gratitude rising in me. No one questioned me. No one demanded anything, something I had longed for all these years. I set my suitcase down and opened the window. In front of me, the vast blue sea stretched all the way to the horizon. The wind blew in, carrying the salty tang. I inhaled deeply, feeling as though everything old and heavy clinging to me was falling away with the breeze. That afternoon, I went to the market alone for the first time, but not to prepare dinner for a whole family as before. I only bought a bit of fresh fish, a few tomatoes, a small bunch of greens, and a handful of scallions. The vendor smiled. "Cooking just for yourself?" I softly replied, "Yes, only for one." Saying those words, I felt my chest suddenly lighten. For the first time, I didn't have to calculate. This one likes that dish. The other can't eat this. I only bought what I wanted to cook for myself. Back in the room, I clumsily prepared the meal. The tiny kitchen only had a single burner gas stove and a few old pots. I chopped vegetables, washed the fish, and lit the flame. The fragrant smell of fried fish filled the air. Steam rose from the hot and sour soup. I set the meal on the table and sat across from myself. At first, the quiet felt disorienting, but then I took a bite of fish, a spoonful of soup, and realized I could still smile while eating a meal made only for me. As night fell, I placed a small wooden chair by the window and sat listening to the waves. The sky of the little town, unpolluted by city lights, revealed stars clear and twinkling. I lifted my head to look, and a deep emotion stirred inside me. For decades, I had never stopped to gaze at the stars, to simply live for that moment. I had rushed and worried, forgetting that life could be this simple and beautiful. The next day, I bought a few small flower pots to place by the window, a pot of yellow chrysanthemums, a pot of purple geraniums, and a tiny cactus. Every morning, I watered them and watched their buds slowly bloom. Those flowers were a reminder that I too could start again, that I could still blossom even at the end of my life's road. In the morning, I strolled down to the shore barefoot on the damp sand, letting the waves wash over my ankles. I watched the children play, their laughter carried in the wind. I smiled too, without bitterness. In the past, children's laughter had always meant duty and burden. Now I could watch without feeling bound. I simply enjoyed the moment as a free spectator. Gradually, I realized I could still be happy. Happiness didn't have to come from my children's success, nor from words of thanks that never came. Happiness could begin with a bowl of hot soup, a blooming flower pot, or an afternoon sitting and watching the waves. That evening, I opened my diary and wrote, day, month, year. Today I laughed. A small smile, but one truly from within. I ate a meal just for myself. I watched the sea, watched the stars, and I realized I can still live. I closed the diary, my heart warm. I knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but at least I had found a beginning, a small, peaceful place where I could be reborn from the ashes of my old life. During those first days in the seaside town, I lived simply, letting myself adjust to the quiet. But more and more I realized something. To truly be free, I not only needed to leave physically, but I also had to cut the invisible strings my children had long tied around me. And so I began taking small steps, silent but decisive, to reclaim ownership of my life. One morning, I put on neat clothes and looked at myself in the mirror, an old face with skin lined by wrinkles, but my eyes were shining. I whispered, "Today I will take back what is mine." The first destination was the bank. With my bank account in hand, I walked into the hall. The young teller greeted me politely. I spoke with a steady voice. "Please help me cancel all the supplementary cards tied to this account immediately." The teller looked surprised, asking, "Ma'am, are you sure?" Because once canceled, those holding supplementary cards from this account, such as your children, will no longer have access. I lifted my head, looked her straight in the eyes, my voice no longer trembling as it once did. Exactly. I want them to learn to manage their own money, not live off their mother. When I signed the cancellation form, my hand trembled, but inside I felt as though a weight had been lifted. The scratch of the pen against paper sounded crisp, affirming that from now on I would no longer be drained without knowing. The next day, I went to the notary office. In my bag were the documents for a small piece of land on the outskirts. Land I had kept with the thought of someday for the children. For years, I saw it as an inheritance, a way to make up for the shortages they had once resented. But today I knew clearly if I kept that land for them, I was only prolonging the cycle of exploitation. The notary asked, "Why are you selling in such a hurry? Is there a special reason?" I smiled. "The only reason is that I need it to live for me, not for anyone else." When I signed the contract, I clearly felt my hand no longer trembling like the day before. On the contrary, it was firm, as though my whole body was channeling strength into that act. I knew I had just cut away another chain that had imprisoned me. In the following days, I continued reviewing everything. I contacted the bank and requested the cancellation of all guarantee rights I had foolishly signed for David. I received a sympathetic look from the staff. "Ma'am, you know this will cause your son financial trouble, don't you?" I nodded gently. "I know, but that's the lesson he needs to learn. I cannot pay for him all his life." Saying those words, I felt a determination rise within me like never before. I was no longer afraid of being called selfish, because if selfishness meant protecting myself, then after 70 years, I deserved to be selfish at least once. Each step wore me out. But after each document I signed, I felt a piece of my heart come back. I realized that silence was no longer a mask of endurance. It had become strength. The strength to act quietly without explanations, without asking permission. That evening, I sat in the little rented room, opened the window, and looked out at the sea. Waves crashed repeatedly, and moonlight spread silver over the water. I wrote in my journal, "Today I cut another binding rope." My hands trembled, but my eyes were bright. I am no longer the weak mother who only knows how to sacrifice. I am a woman learning to stand upright on her own 2 feet. After writing, I closed the notebook and placed my hand over my chest. I felt the rebirth in each beat of my heart. Maybe tomorrow my children would discover everything. They would be angry, accusing, perhaps even begging. But I knew I had gone too far to turn back. I smiled and looked toward the night horizon. The waves kept coming, steady and persistent. I told myself, like the sea, from now on, I will live for myself quietly, but indestructible. I knew sooner or later the 3 of them would find out about my steps. And just as I expected, a few days later, my phone rang nonstop. The screen lit with familiar names I had once waited for, but now seeing them tightened my chest. The first message came from Anna. She wrote quickly, full of exclamation points. "Mom, I just checked the account. Why are the supplementary cards all blocked? What did you do? I still have my daughter's tuition to pay. Are you going to abandon my child?" I read it and sat very still. Before, I would have rushed to the bank, finding some way to manage. But this time, I simply set the phone down and took a long breath. I no longer wanted to be pulled back into that whirlpool. Before I could think further, David called. His voice shouted over the line, part fury, part panic. "Mom, what did you do?" "My loans are all being denied. The bank says you canceled the guarantee. Do you know what this means? I'll lose everything. Why are you so selfish?" "On clues." I listened, my heart lurching, but I didn't crumble like I used to. I picked up the phone and answered calmly. "David, for years I have carried too much for you. From now on, you must take responsibility for your own decisions. I can't keep being your shield." He was silent for a few seconds, then shouted, "You want to let me die? You really are. You ruined our lives," and hung up. I sat looking at the darkened phone, feeling oddly peaceful. Their accusations no longer made me tremble. I understood clearly. Those were not the words of grown children, but the cries of those who had just lost their crutch. That afternoon, Michael texted. Unlike the other 2, he wrote more succinctly. "Mom, I heard you sold the plot. Is it true? Why would you do that?" "I plan to build a house there for my wife and the kids later." "What are we supposed to do now?" I was silent for a moment. Of the 3, Michael rarely demanded anything outright, but his long-accepted silence had also been his consent to benefit from me. I answered, each word slow. "Michael, that land belongs to me. I decided to use it to live for myself, not for anyone else. You all must take care of your own families as I once took care of you. After that, my phone kept buzzing with missed calls and long messages. At first, everything was reproach. You're selfish. You never understood us. How could you abandon your grandchildren? But then a few days later, the tone shifted. Anger turned to pleading. Mom, please come back. We need you. Mom, I can't make ends meet. Help me just this once. Mom, I'm sorry for what I said. Please come home. I read each message, my heart tightening. I had once longed to hear an apology from my children. But when it finally arrived, I realized it wasn't because they truly understood. It was because they needed something from me. That night, I sat by the window. The sea outside still murmured and rolled. I wrote in my journal. My children called me the one who ruined their lives. Now that I've left, they're starting to know hardship. But I will not return. If I go back, everything will revert to the old pattern, and I will lose myself once more. The next day, I summoned my courage and sent one last message to the family group. Children, I raised and sacrificed for you my whole life without ever expecting repayment. But when I heard you say I ruined your lives, I realized I had become only a shadow. From now on, I will live for myself. Don't call me selfish. It is a right I should have had long ago. I sold the land, canceled the guarantees, and cut the supplementary cards. The house still belongs to me, but I won't sell it immediately. You must arrange to move out. Take responsibility for your own lives. That is what maturity looks like. I pressed send and set the phone down. I knew that after this message, there would be a distance between me and them that would be hard to bridge. But I also knew that only this could truly break the vicious cycle. I sat a long time listening to the sea. My heart ached, but it did not tremble. I had chosen my path, and for the first time, I felt how powerful silence could be. This morning, I sat on the small wooden chair on the porch of the rented room, looking out at the vast blue sea. The waves kept their steady rhythm, patient as if never growing tired. 70 years of life had shown me many changes, but I had never felt as peaceful as I did now. Maybe because for the first time I was not forced to carry anyone else's burdens. I picked up my journal and flipped back through the pages I had written over the past days. Each trembling line recorded the journey of cutting one binding after another. I smiled, seeing how I had changed. No longer the woman who bowed her head to accept blame for a lifetime. I had dared to stand up, even if only with silence. Margaret visited at noon, bringing a basket of fruit, her eyes bright when she saw me. Eleanor, you're different, she said as she set the basket down. I can see a light in you I've never seen before. I smiled and poured tea. Maybe this time I am truly living for myself. The two of us sat talking, listening to the waves offshore. Margaret told me that she had run into an old acquaintance in the city, and they had mentioned my family. It turned out that after I left, my 3 children truly stumbled. Anna struggled to manage her daughter's tuition. With no one left to rescue her, she was forced to take on extra jobs, juggling housework and childcare. David shouldered a huge debt because he no longer had my guarantees, and his partners lost their trust. As for Michael, when he realized for certain that I had sold the piece of land, he and his wife quarreled bitterly, their future suddenly shaken. I listened, not with glee, but also no longer with pain. Simply I saw it as the inevitable result. Everyone must learn to take responsibility. Without this shock, they would have continued to live in the illusion that there was always a mother standing there, forever ready to shoulder the consequences for them. Margaret placed her hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You did the right thing. Sometimes love isn't about giving more, but about stopping. And it's that stopping that forces them to grow up." I nodded, gazing far out at the horizon. I didn't know how my 3 children would change. But I knew one thing: I would not go back to being their shadow. I had given them my youth, my strength, my dreams, and it was time for them to walk on their own. That afternoon, I went down to the shore, barefoot in the sand. The waves crashed against the beach, leaving white foam that quickly dissolved. I sat down and wrote another line in my notebook. 70 years old, but I am only just beginning to live not to atone, not to prove my worth through sacrifice, but to be myself. I thought about silence, once a chain, now a weapon. Before, I was silent out of fear, out of submission. But now my silence was a decisive answer, a shield to protect myself. No arguing, no disputes, just one quiet step, and my whole world had changed. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the moon rise high. I imagined my 3 children, probably struggling now. My heart still twinged a little. After all, they are my flesh and blood. But instead of weakness, I whispered softly, "My children, I still love you. But this love is no longer blind sacrifice. If you want, you must find your own path." I picked up my pen and wrote again in my diary. My journey is not over, but today I am no longer a victim. I am the master of my life. Outside, the waves continued steadily like an echo. I closed the notebook and smiled faintly. In my heart, one door had closed, but another had just opened, leading to a new life, light and free. And so, in the peaceful moment of that seaside town, I knew I had truly closed the door on a bitter past. No more torment, no more dependence. Only me, a 70-year-old woman, but for the first time learning to live for myself. Motherhood is not a ticket for children to live forever dependent and blaming. While a mother is there, they grow accustomed to stretching out their hands, seeing sacrifice as duty. But when the mother stands up and quietly pulls her hand back, all illusions collapse. Only then is the emptiness they created revealed. The harsh truth is blind love only nurtures selfishness. Sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is to leave so her children can taste maturity with their own trembling steps.